There are truths that don't arrive through evidence. They arrive through repetition, not the repetition of events, the repetition of recognition. I spent years believing the mind was the safest place I owned, a place with carefully designed boundaries, every thought examined, every emotion measured, every conclusion earned through patience rather than impulse. Nothing entered that space without permission. At least, that's what I believed. Then something happened that didn't ask for permission. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single conversation that explained it, no unforgettable moment that divided my life into before and after. Instead, it happened so quietly that I almost missed it. A subtle shift, a pattern too precise to dismiss. I began noticing the impossible. Not impossible because it violated reality. Impossible because it violated everything I understood about myself. I stopped anticipating my own thoughts before someone else's presence seemed woven into the way I processed them, not as influence, not as control, but as a reference point my mind had chosen without consulting me. That realization disturbed me more than anything emotional ever could, because emotions rise and emotions fade. Structures don't. Once the structure of your perception changes, every experience that follows is filtered through a new architecture, and there's no simple way back. I searched for logical explanations. Coincidence, projection, habit bar taught recognition. The mind is remarkably skilled at inventing reasons for what it cannot immediately explain. I tested every possibility, pulled every thread, questioned every conclusion before allowing myself to believe even a fraction of it. Yet every explanation eventually collapsed under the same weight. Accuracy. The pattern didn't become weaker with time. It became clearer, not louder. Clearer, like a picture slowly coming into focus until denying what you're seeing requires more effort than accepting it. That's when I understood something that changed everything. The deepest shifts in a person's life rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive like storms. They arrive like gravity, invisible, constant, impossible to argue with once you notice their effect. You don't see gravity, you witness what it moves. And I began witnessing what this was moving inside me, my attention, my perception, my silence. Even the questions I asked myself had started changing, not because someone gave me new answers, but because their existence forced me to ask better questions, questions I had avoided for years. Can another person's presence alter the architecture of your thinking without either of you intending it? Can recognition exist before explanation? Can understanding appear before history has had the chance to build it? I don't know. What I do know is that once those questions entered my mind, they never left. And maybe that's where every irreversible story truly begins. Not with certainty, not with emotion, but with a single realization that refuses to become untrue, no matter how many times you try to walk away from it. There comes a moment when observation is no longer enough. You can analyze something from every angle. You can dismantle it into pieces. You can question every assumption until nothing remains except uncertainty. But some experiences survive analysis. Not because they're beyond logic, but because they remain consistent no matter how closely you examine them. That's what unsettled me. The closer I looked, the less this resembled coincidence. It wasn't about words. Words are easy. Anyone can learn what to say. Anyone can study behavior, memorize patterns, and imitate understanding. Real recognition doesn't happen there. It happens underneath language, in the space where reactions exist before explanation. I started noticing it in moments no one else would have remembered. A pause that arrived at exactly the right time. A silence that never felt empty. A thought that seemed complete before it had fully formed. None of those moments were dramatic. Individually, they meant almost nothing. Together, they formed something impossible to ignore. A pattern. and patterns reveal structure. Most people mistake connection for emotion. I don't. Emotion changes with circumstance. Structure doesn't. Structure determines how something behaves under pressure, how it responds to uncertainty, how it remains itself even when everything around it changes. That's why I became so careful, because if what I was noticing was structural, then it wasn't temporary. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't fascination. It wasn't a passing chapter waiting for time to erase it. It was becoming part of the foundation. That realization demanded honesty, not about someone else. About myself, I had always believed I understood the limits of my own mind, its habits, its defenses, its carefully built distance. Yet here I was, watching those limits rearrange themselves without resistance. Not collapse, rearrange, as though they had been waiting for a missing piece I never knew existed. That thought should have frightened me. Instead, it made everything unexpectedly quiet, because deep inside, beneath every question and every attempt to explain it away, there was one truth that refused to disappear. I wasn't becoming someone different. I was becoming someone more accurate. And accuracy has a strange effect on the human mind. It doesn't create noise. It removes it. Suddenly, the distractions lose their importance. The performances become obvious. The conversations that once felt meaningful begin to sound rehearsed. Not because the world changed, but because your perception did. That's the hidden cost of genuine clarity. Once you've experienced it, you can't convincingly pretend you haven't. You begin seeing the difference between attention and presence, between conversation and understanding, between people who hear your words and those who somehow recognize the silence beneath them. And once you recognize that difference, you stop searching for what is loud. You start trusting what remains steady, because the strongest truths rarely demand to be believed. They simply continue existing until disbelief becomes impossible. There is a difference between discovering something and allowing it to change you. Most people never notice that distinction. They collect experiences, they collect memories, they collect people. But they remain essentially the same, carrying every encounter like an object placed on a shelf. This wasn't like that. This wasn't something I could place outside myself and observe from a safe distance. It had already become part of the way I observed everything else. That's when I understood the real weight of awareness. Awareness isn't passive. It reshapes the one who carries it. At first, I tried to preserve the person I had always been, the one who trusted distance. The one who believed that clarity came from standing apart, the one who measured every step before allowing himself to move. That version of me had survived for years. It was careful, disciplined, predictable, and because it was predictable, it felt safe. But safety has a hidden cost. The longer you live inside carefully constructed certainty, the harder it becomes to recognize the moments that ask you to grow beyond it. Growth doesn't usually arrive as comfort. It arrives as contradiction, as the quiet realization that your old way of understanding reality is no longer large enough to contain what you're experiencing now. That's where I found myself, standing between two versions of truth. One built from everything I had learned, the other forming from everything I couldn't deny. Neither one was false, but only one could carry me forward. I kept asking myself the same question. What if the greatest mistake isn't trusting too much, but refusing to acknowledge something simply because it arrived differently than expected? That question stayed with me, not for hours, not for days, for longer than I wanted to admit, because every honest answer pointed in the same direction. Some realities don't need to force their way into your life. They become undeniable through consistency, through presence, through the quiet certainty that remains even after every doubt has been given its chance to speak. Eventually, I stopped searching for an escape from the realization. Not because I had solved every mystery, but because I understood something more important. Not every truth is meant to be solved. Some truths are meant to be lived. That understanding changed the way I looked at everything. I stopped asking whether this fit the categories I already knew. I started asking whether the categories themselves had always been too small. And perhaps that's what transformation truly is, not becoming someone else, not abandoning who you've been, but allowing your understanding of reality to become wider than your fear of change. Maybe that's why certain moments refuse to disappear. They aren't asking to be remembered. They're asking to become part of you. And once that happens, you no longer carry the experience. The experience quietly begins carrying you. From that point forward, every decision becomes different, not because the world has changed, but because the person looking at the world has. There is a stage beyond realization. Most people think recognition is the destination. It isn't. Recognition is only the doorway. The real transformation begins after the mind accepts what it can no longer deny. Because acceptance has consequences, the moment you stop arguing with reality, reality begins asking something from you. Not words, not promises. Presence, complete, undivided presence. That's the part no one prepares you for. It's easy to admire clarity from a distance. It's much harder to live according to it. I began noticing it in places that had nothing to do with anyone else. The way I moved through ordinary days. The way familiar routines suddenly felt incomplete. The way conversations that once seemed meaningful now dissolved into noise before they reached any real depth. Nothing around me had changed. Yet everything felt different, because perception had shifted. And perception is the invisible foundation beneath every decision we make. Chomp the foundation, and the entire structure quietly rearranges itself. I realized I had spent years protecting certainty, believing that if I understood enough, I could prevent the unexpected from reaching me. But life has never asked for perfect understanding. It asks for honest attention. Those are not the same thing. Understanding tries to control. Attention allows reality to reveal itself. For the first time, I stopped trying to force every experience into familiar definitions. I simply watched, without rushing, without resisting, without demanding immediate answers. Something remarkable happened. The less I struggled to explain everything, the more precise everything became. Patterns emerged that I would have missed if I had been searching too aggressively. Small moments carried unexpected weight. Ordinary conversations revealed extraordinary truths. Silence stopped feeling like an absence. It became evidence. Evidence that not everything valuable needs to announce itself. That realization changed something fundamental inside me. I had always believed strength came from holding tightly to what I knew. Now I began to wonder if real strength was something quieter. The willingness to remain open, even when certainty would feel more comfortable. Perhaps wisdom isn't collecting more answers. Perhaps it's developing the patience to let truth unfold at its own pace. Not every meaningful change arrives with certainty. Some changes begin as a quiet shift in perspective, one that slowly transforms the way you see yourself, the people around you, and the life you've been living all along. Looking back, I can see the moment everything began. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was simply the first time I stopped resisting what I already knew deep inside. And sometimes that single act of honesty changes more than a lifetime of certainty ever could. There is a moment when truth stops asking for permission. Not because it becomes louder, but because you've run out of places to hide from it. I think that's where I am now. For a long time, I believed that clarity would bring certainty. That once I understood something completely, every question would disappear. I was wrong. Clarity doesn't erase questions. It changes them. The questions become quieter. sharper, less concerned with what is happening, and more concerned with who you become because it happened. That is a far more difficult question to answer, because it doesn't allow distance, it doesn't allow observation without participation, it asks you to step inside your own life instead of standing outside it, analyzing every possibility until nothing moves. I've lived that way for longer than I care to admit, always watching, always calculating, always making sure every decision passed through the filter of certainty before I allowed it to become real. It felt responsible, it felt intelligent. But now I wonder if it was simply another way of delaying change, because there are experiences that don't wait for perfect understanding. They continue unfolding whether you're ready or not. And eventually, they leave you with only two choices. You can spend your life explaining them away, or you can let them explain something about you. That realization unsettled me more than anything else, because it forced me to admit a quiet truth. The greatest transformations rarely announce themselves as transformations. They disguise themselves as ordinary moments, a conversation you almost forgot, a silence that lingered longer than expected, a realization that seemed insignificant, until months later, when you discovered it had quietly redirected the course of your thinking. Life doesn't always change through dramatic events. Sometimes it changes through accumulation, one honest moment, then another, until one day you wake up and realize the person making today's decisions would be unrecognizable to the person you were a year ago. Not because your identity disappeared, but because your understanding expanded beyond the limits you once defended. Maybe that's what growth has always been. Not becoming someone new, becoming someone less divided. Someone whose thoughts, actions, and inner truth finally begin moving in the same direction. There is an unusual peace in that, not the peace of having every answer, the peace of no longer pretending that certainty is required before you can live honestly. I've stopped waiting for the perfect explanation. Some realities don't become meaningful because we define them. They become meaningful because they quietly reshape the way we see everything else. And perhaps that's the final lesson hidden beneath all of this. The deepest changes in our lives are rarely chosen in a single moment. They are accepted one quiet realization at a time, until eventually you look back and understand that the transformation didn't happen on the day you noticed it. It began much earlier. The first time your mind recognized a truth that your heart would spend the rest of your life learning how to live. There is one final illusion that almost everyone carries. The belief that life changes because of the moments we remember. It doesn't. Life changes because of the moments that quietly rewrite us before we realize they're doing it. The conversation that seemed ordinary. The silence that lingered a little longer than expected. The realization that appeared so gently you almost dismissed it. Those are the moments that alter the architecture of a life, not because they demand attention, but because they become impossible to remove. I've stopped asking when that happened. There is no answer that would satisfy me. Some transformations don't begin at a measurable point. They emerge slowly, like daylight. No one can point to the exact second night becomes morning. Yet everyone knows the moment the darkness is gone. Perhaps awareness works the same way. It doesn't arrive, it accumulates. One observation, one honest question, one impossible recognition after another, until eventually you are no longer the person who asked the first question. That realization carries a strange kind of freedom. For years, I believed strength meant remaining unchanged, remaining consistent, remaining untouched by whatever the world placed in front of me. Now I understand something entirely different. A stone can remain unchanged for centuries. That doesn't make it alive. Life is movement. Life is adaptation. Life is the quiet courage to allow reality to refine you without losing the essence of who you are. There is no weakness in transformation. The weakness is pretending that nothing meaningful has ever reached you. I won't pretend anymore, not because I've solved every mystery, not because every uncertainty has disappeared, but because I finally understand that certainty was never the destination. Awareness was. And awareness always asks something in return. It asks for honesty. The kind of honesty that exists when no one else is watching, the kind that refuses to perform, the kind that quietly admits, I am no longer who I was. That sentence isn't a loss. It's evidence. Evidence that life succeeded in doing what it was always meant to do, expand you, deepen you, teach you that the most important truths rarely arrive wrapped in dramatic endings. They become part of your breathing, part of your perception, part of the invisible rhythm through which you experience every ordinary day. Maybe that's why the deepest transformations are almost invisible from the outside. People see the same face, the same voice, the same routines. They assume nothing has changed. They never notice that an entirely different world now exists behind the eyes looking back at them. And perhaps they were never meant to. Not every transformation is meant to be explained. Some are meant to be lived quickly, completely, without the need for applause or validation. So I won't search for a perfect ending to this story, because endings suggest that something has finished. This hasn't. It has simply become part of the person I am still becoming. And maybe that is the only conclusion that has ever been true. The most important chapters of our lives don't end when we reach understanding. They begin there. Everything after that isn't about discovering who we are. It's about having the courage to live as the person we've finally recognized.